Thank you very much for being on the programme. Great to speak to you. Well, we've got a new government compared to when we last spoke. How do you think they're getting on so far?
A good start, I think. A lot to do on the economic front. You know, mission one for them is growth, and we're still missing growth, Sophie, but it's early days, and there's still plenty of time, I think, to put those building blocks in place to get growth going after a couple of decades of lost growth, really.
Let's talk about growth later in the interview, because I know it's something that you feel very strongly about. But first, I just want to get your reaction to the big report we've had out today. This really is something that Keir Starmer's government will be judged on, live or die on, the NHS. And we've got the Dary report out, which of course is a health challenge, but it's also an economic challenge as well. What's your reaction to that report?
Well, in a way, there's no huge surprises in that. We knew our health and social care system was fragile. And we knew that is having serious consequences for our economy. You know, the 9 million inactive people across the UK, and 3 or 4 million of those long-term sick. So those fault lines, well established. What the Dary report does do is put a number to the investment required to begin the process of repair, 40 billion give or take. And the question then becomes, how is that to be financed when taken alongside the other elements, our education system, our transport system, our councils, our colleges, our universities, that also have suffered from a starvation diet investment-wise over many decades?
You see, this is the thing, because I feel like there's the bit of a report that Keir Starmer's kind of slightly ignoring. Like, he's talking an awful lot about reform and how we shouldn't be pouring more money into hospitals that aren't improving. But as you say, there's another bit of the report that says, actually, when it comes to capital investment on things like equipment, scanners, buildings, we are way behind, tens and tens of billions behind. But they're not talking about that bit. Are you worried that they're just going to ignore the investment that's required?
Well, I mean, the time for having that conversation is coming soon at the end of October with the budget. That and the spending review next year will be really the points, Sophie, where we see the true colours of this government. It's one thing to be identifying the fault lines, it's one thing to be revealing the black holes, but the big question, currently unanswered, is how are those fault lines to be closed? How are those holes to be filled? There's no question that can't be done on the cheap. There's no question that will require some significant and long-term investment, capital investment in the many of our systems, health, education, local, that need fixing.
So you say the NHS does need more money?
It does. I mean, I think that was known before. The scale of it perhaps was not known, and now we have a much better line of sight on that being the case. I mean, it's known for some time that we have chronically underinvested in buildings and in kit, and have compensated with people. And that's the self-same as saying that productivity in the health sector has been flat or declining, and that now needs to change.
We have, as you say, we're going to find out the true colours of the government at the budget. It feels to me like there are two, I guess, opposing forces. The one is the focus on growth and long-term investment, as you've been talking about, and then the other, of course, is the need to balance the books, fiscal responsibility, what some might even describe as austerity. Which force do you think should win?
Growth, very clearly. You grow your way out of a fiscal hole. Austerity is not the route to solving even a fiscal problem. And of course, it's the last thing you need from a growth perspective. So this needs to be a growth first rather than fiscal first budget. And the starting point for that needs to be that investment, Sophie, across the piece. Because we know that without the investment, growth tomorrow will never come about. So, you know, the existing plans see public investment in this country falling relative to national income over the course of this Parliament. As far as I can tell, there has not been a country in human history that has seen growth pick up at the same time as public investment has been falling as a share of national income, where the starting point, by the way, is UK investing too little relative to pretty much all of our international competitors. So investment, investment, investment is the key lodestar of growth and should be the key lodestar of the budget.
There are some signs that that's not the path that the Chancellor is going to go down. The report out today, there hasn't been speak about a big new investment in the NHS. There's been infrastructure projects that have been cancelled, the A303, for example. Do you think that this government may end up following the austerity path?
Well, I hope not, and there's still time.
But do you accept that there are signals that...
There are risks
That's
around
something.
that. I felt the mini fiscal event in July, the black hole event, was unnecessary and probably unhelpful, economically at least. I mean, the politics are above my pay grade, but on the economics, you know, it's one thing to reveal a black hole, if that indeed is what it is, but just leaving that to sit for 3 months, I think was a bad idea.
What should they have done then?
Well, I think it'd be much better to say nothing until you provide solutions to filling the black hole as well as revealing it. As it was, that's generated fear and foreboding, an uncertainty among consumers, among businesses, among investors in UK PLC, which is unfortunate because just after the election there was a sense of refresh, a sense of renewal, a confidence about the UK, both domestically and internationally, and that just set it back on its heels a bit, which I felt was unnecessary, alongside the partial measures that were taken, which I think have also aroused some concerns about what might come next.
Are you talking about the winter fuel payments?
Well, I said there's two bits. One was that, which sat a bit awkwardly with the line about the broadest shoulders bearing the burden, when it was actually financially fragile people bearing some of that burden. But the other bit, which you mentioned, was that there was some cuts to capital expenditure projects as well. And that's a path I think we can't afford to go down if we are to fix these NHS problems and the well-known, rather too long list of other areas where we have chronically underinvested as a country for too long.
I mean, one of the things that is, I guess, restraining what Rachel Reeves can do in the budget is the fiscal rules.
Yeah.
Should they stay?
Well, I mean, fiscal rules by themselves are a good thing. We need a degree of restraint on governments, we know that. These fiscal rules, those the previous government had and this government has largely inherited, they aren't good. They really put in jeopardy our ability as a country to invest and therefore to grow. So I hope at the forthcoming budget there's scope to relook at those through the lens of what is best to get growth going. And if there's any risk, the existing rules, the debt rule in particular, Sophie, is a pernicious one. If there's any risk that gets in the way, hinders our capacity to fill that £40 billion gap in the NHS and the other gaps we know exist, now's the time not to tweak that, not to fiddle that, but in the first budget to take decisive, radical action, to rethink that fiscal rule in a way that weighs the assets we create as well as the liabilities. So if you build a hospital, record it. Don't ignore it in your fiscal rules. That will be a big, bold shift, a growth-friendly shift, and the sort of thing I think international investors would lap up.
There's one other thing I did want to ask you about while we've got you, because on the programme yesterday we spoke to Nadhim Zahawi, the former Chancellor, and he said that millionaires are leaving the UK because they're worried about tax rises. Is that something that you recognise?
Well, I mean, there's no question in my mind that if we are to make good on the growth mission, that will require a heavy lifting from the private sector and a decent amount of financing from the private sector. So we have to be cautious and careful. We don't scare off the risk takers. We don't scare off the providers of private capital. Now, a person going is neither here nor there for my money. But equally, we've found ourselves in a position now where the only taxes left to levy are those on assets, right? Could be capital gains, could be inheritance tax, could be council tax.
So houses, shares, stuff like
Houses,
that.
shares, bonds. Now, in principle, with a clear blue sky, I'd say it's perfectly fair and reasonable that those income from assets is taxed at similar sorts of rates to income from working. But the sky is not clear. This is the moment where we need risk capital to be coming into the UK. Our savings rates, as well as our investment rates, are chronically low in this country. Doing something now that deters savings means there's less money to finance the investment that ultimately fuels growth. So my point on that is not a millionaire here, a billionaire there. It's rather, let's do something that stirs the spirit of risk takers and risk capital, because that we need desperately to make good on the growth mission.
So would wealth taxes, for example, in the budget be something that you would be concerned about?
We should tread carefully on that in a way that doesn't cut off at its knees the well of goodwill towards the UK that's built up over this year. Suddenly, we find ourselves, Sophie, having been towards the bottom of the international league table for political stability, now being seen internationally as a bastion of political stability.
So there's optimism there, there's hope.
There is. Internationally, we've seen that in the price of UK assets picking up over the course of this year. Let's not do anything that trips us up on that front, because that we need to fuel the growth that ultimately shows up in the living standards of people, particularly in the poorest places.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sophie.